There are over 100 craftable weapons in Destiny 2 right now. With that, I wanted to rank all of them so you know which ones to craft and which ones you should skip out on for PvE. I figured a fun way to do this would be in a tier list so I can give each weapon a definitive ranking and explain why I put it there. This one is all about primaries, but if you're interested in specials and heavies, be sure to check out the previous 2 videos. Timestamps will be in the description if you want to skip to a certain weapon, and I will have the tier list linked down below if you want to put one together for yourself. Real quick, I want to say thank you all so much for the support on this series. I will be doing more tier lists in the future, on top of covering into the light content and bringing builds back to the channel. So if you are enjoying it, definitely be sure to stick around because we are just getting started. But with all that out the way, I hope you enjoy and let's get right into it. All right, so starting off, just like the special weapon tier list, I think it needs to be noted that kinetic primaries will actually do 10% more damage than energy primaries. On top of that, it's also good to note that energy weapons will do more damage to shields and typically have the subclass verb perks on them. So knowing that, most of the time in the game, you're going to be running an energy primary and a special kinetic, so your special weapon does 15% more damage for bosses and majors, while your energy primary is normally just used for ad clear, so just taking out shields faster, and also being able to play into the subclass verbs is typically better. 90% of primaries are used for ad clear, but there are some outliers that can be used for things like champions and some form of single target damage, so I'm going to judge all of these based on that, and if some can do both, I will rank them a little higher. And also, I plan to rank at least one of every single weapon type in S, so you know which one to go craft to have for final shape. Even though something like a pulse rifle might not be the most meta right now, it is good to know what probably is the best craftable version, and that's what this whole tier list is about. But enough with that breakdown, and I'm sorry if this video is going to be an hour long because as you see, there are so many primary weapons. Okay, so starting off with the first one, we're going to have Abyss Defiant. Now this is going to be a 360 round per minute solar auto rifle. Obviously, auto rifles aren't the most meta thing right now. They're not bad in my opinion, but this thing does have a ton of good perks. As you see here, pretty much every single one of these perks can be used for PvE. It's almost better to name the ones that can't. So Zen Moment, you don't really want to use that one. Eye of the Storm, can't really use that one for PvP, but like literally everything else will be good on this auto rifle. You can play into solo verbs with Hill Clip and Incandescent, a crazy good roll. You can play into a melee based perk with Pugilist and Swashbuckler and pair them with the Origin trait. So when you get a melee kill, you will cause explosions with the next weapon kills. Very good origin trait. This is an ad clear machine. It is one of the best auto rifles in the game in my opinion, and even if you want to go a traditional route with just a subsistence or reconstruction and a damage perk, it has it all. There's so many different ways that you can build craft this thing, and for that I think this definitely deserves the S tier. If there was an auto rifle I'm going to put an S tier, it is for sure going to be this one. There are a couple more that are also very good, especially with the origin traits, which we'll get into later, but overall Abyss Defiant has so many different good possibilities that you can craft depending on however you want to play it, and even the origin trait is also very solid. And now next up is the Adhortative. Now this doesn't get a lot of play, but it does have some pretty decent perks like Feed of Frenzy, Shoot to Loot, even Attrition Orbs a little bit, Hill Clip. Alongside that, Disruption Break, Golden Tricorn, Incandescent, you have some okay damage perks, some okay solar verb based perks, and it's also good to note that the Nano Munitions origin trait is also pretty strong. In my opinion, this is one of the better origin traits in the game because you could just virtually never have to reload the gun, but if you are going to be playing into something like Hill Clip or Feed Frenzy, you want to reload the gun obviously a little bit more often. And if you're playing into Incandescent as well, I think there are going to be better Incandescent options later on down this tier list, but this does have a pretty unique role of something like Disruption Break and Shoot to Loot. This makes it a pretty solid GM style weapon because you can break a shield with Disruption Break, then your kinetic weapon can do more damage, and you can pick up ammo anywhere on the map. So I think this is pretty solid. It also has some okay ad clear based perks, but with also the little niche role of Disruption Break and Shoot to Loot, I think this definitely deserves the B tier spot. The next up is the Age-Old Bond. This is going to be a void high impact frame auto rifle, so it can play into volatile. It has stats for Repulsor Brace, Dragonfly, 4 times of charm. You compare that with things like Target Lock if you want like a single target damage option. Obviously that's not going to be that good on a primary weapon, but you also have destabilizing rounds. You compare that with Repulsor Brace, Kill Clip, Tricorn, so just kind of some okay damage perks, alongside the Explosive Pack Origin trait, which I don't think is the best, but if you are playing into a grenade build, you typically do that on Void, so you will get a lot of mileage out of this perk, which is pretty nice, and it has some pretty solid rolls. I don't think this is going to be the best auto rifle in the game, but I think that since it does have some unique interactions with Stabilizer rounds and Repulsor Brace, and the fact that it even has pretty decent ad clear options with things like Dragonfly and Tricorn if you are playing into a grenade based build, which you can do with Explosive Pact, I think think this will be a pretty solid A tier in my opinion. It's not as good as Abyss Defiant's perk pool, and the origin trait on Abyss Defiant is better in my opinion, but I think it is definitely better than Adhortative for ad clear, and that's why I think it definitely deserves the A tier spot. The next up is the Ammit AR2. Now, this is another solar auto rifle. It's precision frame, and it has some okay perks, things like Ambitious Assassins, obviously not the greatest perk, the game stats for all. Alongside that, you do have Incandescent and One for All, so a pretty good ad clear perk, also a pretty solid damage perk as well, one of the highest damage perks in the game. I guess this origin trait is kind of nice if you're going to be reloading at the top half of the magazine, but if you don't have a decent incandescent weapon, kind of like that Adhortative, this can definitely get the job done. This auto rifle is definitely not as good as the other two, but if you need a pretty solid auto rifle, this one definitely has you covered, and it's also extremely easy to craft. But next up, we have the Austringer. Now, this is typically only used in PvP, but if we take a look at its perks for PvE, you have things like Outlaw in the first column, and then the second column, you have Demolitionist, Rampage, and Frenzy. Those are pretty much your go-to options, and the origin trait's not the worst, since this is going to be used on a primary weapon. You can just get some extra discipline and strength if you have your super on kills, so this is pretty nice. But overall, the perk pool for this thing is pretty limited when it does come to PvE, and weapons like this have also just been kind of power crept out the game at this point. Like I said in the beginning, most of the time you're going to be using an energy primary weapon if you are going to be using a primary weapon at all. So with this, you don't have any access to subclass based verbs, and the best ad clear you can do is something like Rampage or maybe even Frenzy, and for that reason I think it is going to go in the C tier. This will take your kinetic slot up since it is kinetic, and that means you can't run something like an Izanagi or just any other kinetic special weapon, heritage, anything like that, and you're going to be missing out on that 15% extra damage that special weapons do get. Whereas if you run something like an energy hand cannon, you can obviously still get that benefit and play into those subclass verbs. So the ad clear for this thing just isn't as good as other options, and also again, things like this have just been power crept. Now, if you just want a solid workhorse hand cannon, this will definitely get you done. Reload speed damage perk, and if you just want to go back to the old days of Destiny, then this is definitely a decent weapon you can use, but I just wouldn't use it over other options. And next up on the list is the Blood Feud. This is our first SMG, and this is going to be a stasis aggressive frame. Taking a look at its perks, it has things like Ambitious Assassin, Pugilist, alongside Frenzy Headstone, maybe Swashbuckler, so not a lot going on for it. I think there is a pretty cool setup with its right hook origin trait, so you can get bonuses when dealing damage with your melee. You can pair that with things like Swash and Pugilist, and you have a pretty fun solid option. But even if you just want to go a Headstone Ambitious Assassin route, this could also play pretty well. It's not going to be the best SMG by any means, not even close once we get later down the line, but since it does have a pretty unique fun setup and it has an okay ad clear role as well with Headstone, I think this definitely can go in the C tier spot. If this is all you have, and if you want to play into it, it's okay, kind of like the Austringer, but I would just pretty much never use this over anything else. But I definitely don't think either of these deserve to go in the not good category, because there is some stuff going on for it. Then next up is the Brigand's Law. Now, this is our first sidearm. It's going to have that same right hook origin trait, and you can take advantage of this since it is a sidearm. You're going to be closer anyway, but this also has some pretty solid perks. Feud of Frenzy, Threat Detector, alongside that Pugilist, Demo, Swashbuckler, Surrounded, and even things like Volt Shot. So you can build this in a couple different ways. You can just go full on energy with Pugilist Demo, which is nice, but how most people are going to build it is with Volt Shot. Again, you're going to be using these typically for ad clear. So it's Volt Shot, Feud of Frenzy, or Volt Shot Threat Detector. You're going to have a crazy amount of reload speed that can proc that Volt Shot, and you're just going to have one of the best ad clear sidearms in the entire game out of all these crafted options. And in that case, I think that definitely deserves to go in the S tier spot. It is very, very strong, and if you are going to be using any sidearm, this is one I would highly recommend using. It is also a rapid fire frame, so it's just fun to use in general, and pretty much the only sidearm that kind of compares to this is maybe something like the Heliocentric, but obviously that was not craftable, so it's not going to be on this list. Now, next up is the Brya's Love. Now, this is going to be a void precision frame scout rifle, so not the greatest in the meta, but it does have some pretty decent perks. Things like Shoot to Loot, Rapid Hit, alongside Explosive Payload, Precision Instrument, Frenzy, Pugilist, Tricorn, Stabilizer rounds. You have some pretty good utility perks, some pretty good damage perks. Obviously, Rapid Hit, you can get your reload speed up. Shoot to Loot with Explosive Payload, you can pick orbs up, just shoot the ground beside them. Very, very solid. It's a unique interaction that not a lot of weapons have, and since you can craft this, I think that definitely will bump it up a little bit. But it even has loose change to Destabilizer rounds if you want to play into that, so you get more reload speed, you can act clear with it. This thing is not the greatest, but with its unique interaction and kind of fun perk combinations for scout rifles, I think it is pretty solid. I will note that the origin trait is not the greatest, but I do think it is going to be better than something like Blood Feud and Austringer, so that's why I think it's going to go in the B tier. Kind of like that Adhortative, it has some pretty unique things going on for it. It's definitely not the greatest thing in the game, but if you do build into those unique things, it definitely can be pretty solid. Now, next up is the BxR-55 Battler, or the Battle Rifle. Now, this has some pretty solid PvE perks. Outlaw, Demo, Pugilist in the first column, alongside Incandescent. maybe Kill Clip. That's probably going to be your two best options. Its origin trait, so you can swap to it faster, really isn't the greatest. Honestly, a thing to note though is that since this is the legacy frame, it has perfect hipfire accuracy, and I think that is kind of slept on in PvE. Obviously in PvP it's very strong, but just being able to hipfire this weapon and just get headshots is very, very nice. And once you pair that with its perk combinations, I think it is a relatively strong. Demo Incandescent, if you're playing it into a solar grenade based build, you could just explode everything. Even if you want to go Pugilist Incandescent, if you're playing into a melee build, that's also pretty strong. And if you want to go a traditional damage route with Kill Clip, it's not the best in the game anymore, but it is still pretty solid. But for the most part, I have always used the Demo Incandescent role. It is very, very strong, and I think that's why it deserves to go in the A tier. Perfect hit for accuracy, very good for playing into solar based builds, and it can get you a lot of mileage on both your melee and grenade. The next up is the Calus Mini-Tool. I think we already all know where this one's going to go, but it has things like Disruption Break, Surround It, Incandescent, with Incandescent being its main option alongside Unrelenting and Threat Detector. Those are probably going to be its two main options. I run Unrelenting and Incandescent just to get that extra health, which is nice, and then obviously with Incandescent you can make everything explode. Its origin trait's also again pretty decent, because since this is a primary weapon, you'll get a lot of kills with it, so you can have this proc pretty much all the time. Obviously if your super is full, so you just have a permanent 20 discipline and strength. And since this is a 900 RPM, you will actually get the bonus mobility that those weapons do provide. So for more movement, some of the best ad clear in the game, even some pretty decent damage perks as well, a way to heal you, this is definitely going into S tier. I think we all know this was going here. If you're playing into a solo build, this has pretty much always been the go-to option, but it does have some competition now with things like this Defiant. That's why I think they're both in the S tier. Next up is Chattering Bone. This is going to be a lightweight frame pulse rifle. It is kinetic, so you're kind of already playing into the fact that you can't run a kinetic special weapon, and it's also not going to be doing more damage to the shields, but it does have some pretty decent perks with things like kinetic trimmers, also rampage for a damage perk, and it also has things like rapid hit, kill clip, so you can have double damage perks, which is pretty cool. But I think if you are crafting this for PvE, most people are going to be going with rapid hit and kinetic trimmers. This is a decent GM weapon, and the fact that it is kinetic, you will actually do more damage to champions, which is nice. If you swap to this, you could just obviously get a bunch of reload speed, stability, reload it, proc kinetic trimmers, and you'll be pretty solid. Now kinetic trimmers and shoot to loot probably will be a better option, so something like battle scars will be better, but again, battle scars isn't craftable, so we just have to go off with what we're working with, and that's why I think this is going to be B tier. Again, pretty solid for a GM type weapon, and it does have double damage if you are trying to play into ad clear with it, but it is pretty good for the things that it does offer. Next up is Come to Pass. Now this is going to be a high impact frame arc auto rifle. This thing, it has some okay perks, honestly. It's nothing too crazy, but it's one of those weapons that have some pretty unique interactions. For its ad clear damage perks, you're pretty much just going for stats for all, one for all, just so you can hit 3 targets. You're going to get a huge damage boost, you're going to get a bunch of stats. I wouldn't use this over anything else, but if you know that's what you want to use for, you do have that. And you can even pair stats for all with something like Dragonfly, but you also have things like Genesis and a dash of munitions, so this is very solid for just taking shields down. This isn't the strongest anymore now that match game's not in the game anymore, but if you are needing something to, I guess, take shields down, this is nice because it can reload your gun as well. Alongside that, you do have Shoot to Loot. Shoot to Loot is a pretty solid perk pretty much everywhere in PvE, and it does have the origin trait, so you can make the enemies do 10% less damage when you do damage to them, so this is also pretty nice. So kind of just a unique role. It has some okay ad clear perks, and it also has some unique interactions, and for that I think it definitely deserves to go in the B tier spot. Again, I don't think we're going to be using this over other options, but if match game ever does come back, obviously with the dash munitions Genesis, that's going to be a pretty solid perk combination. And if this is the only ad clear option you do have, it does have some pretty solid perks that you can go for that as well. Our next weapon is going to be Different Times. This is going to be a strand rapid fire frame pulse rifle. It has some okay perks on it with things like subsistence and stats roll alongside outlaw. Then you can have hatchling on it as well, and then even things like multi-kill clip, tricorn, so kind of some okay damage perks. Obviously not the greatest. I think to note, I hate this origin trait. It is terrible in my opinion. You want to have no abilities to get bonuses, and that's almost something you never want to do in PvE. Your whole point of PvE is to try to get your abilities back, so this will pretty much never be proc. But with the perk combinations, things like stats for all, multi-kill clip, or subsistence, gold tricorn, outlaw, hatchling, it's okay. If this is your only hatchling weapon, I guess you can make use out of it, but again, this is going to go into your kinetic slot, so you can't use kinetic special. So, and for that reason, I think it's going to go C tier. It has some okay perks. I definitely don't think it should go not good tier because it does have some decent perks. And again, if this is your only hatchling weapon, this is something you definitely could craft, but there are way better hatchling options even in this tier list once we get later down the line. The next up is the Disparity. This is going to be a high impact 4-round burst stasis pulse rifle. It has some pretty decent perks with things like outlaw, rapid hit, and pretty much every single perk other than hit seeker in the second column is solid. If you want to go a traditional damage route, you have things like one for all for the highest damage boost in the game, kill clip as well, headstone if you want to play into into obviously stasis based builds. And what's really cool about this weapon is that with Headstone and the Haka Breach armaments, this does more damage to stasis crystals. So this weapon alone can actually break the stasis crystal without actually having to take Whisper of Rending to do more damage to the stasis crystals. And that is a unique interaction that pretty much only this weapon can do. I know if you do have the wild card origin trait, if you get a kill and you make that little Telesto bolt, it can break the crystal. So that interaction is pretty much this interaction's competition. And this being the only weapon in the game, in my knowledge, that can do this, I think this is going to bump it up a little bit, and since it also has pretty decent damage perks as well, I think this definitely deserves to go in the B tier spot. Unfortunately, since it is stasis, it will go in that kinetic slot, and I think there are going to be better headstone options as well compared to this thing, even with this unique interaction. But overall, it is a pretty solid pulse rifle. It definitely deserves to go in the good category. I just don't think I'm going to use it over some other options. Now, next up is Doom with Chelchis. Now, this one might surprise a lot of you, but I think this is the best scout rifle in the game, and I'm going to go and throw it in S tier. Now, I'm going to explain why. It has a ton of good perks: Stats for All, Explosive Payload, Fireflight, Vorpal if you want to play into that, alongside Repulsive Race, Unrelenting, One for All, Frenzy, Focus Fury, and Dragonflight. Now, just to go and get it out of the way, with Focus Fury and Vorpal, you do have 2 damage perks that are going to be for champions. So if you want to build this into something like a GM, that's pretty solid for that. But you also have things like Firefly and Dragonflight for Actor. You cause 2 explosions on a primary kill, but you also even have things like Explosive Payload and One for All. So you can sit here and shoot 3 different targets, get the highest damage boost in the game. Explosive Payload is also giving you that extra damage. Explosive Payload can also proc One for All if you hit multiple targets. It's Void, so you can play into Volatile if you want Frenzy or Unrelenting for health and just more damage with the Frenzy route. Stats for All as well. This thing has so many cracked perks on it. There are so many different combinations you could do from ad clear and single target. And its origin trait is also very solid, so you get more magazine size once you reload the gun near teammates. I don't know if there's any other scout rifle in the game that has a better perk pool than this. And in my opinion, at least on the crafted tier list, this is for sure going to be going into S tier. This is what all the other scout rifles need to compare to. And I personally have used this thing a ton, especially on something like a Gerfalcon's Hunter. It is very solid for any in-game content and even just normal content because you do have Firefly and Dragonfly. And next up, we have the Drang. This is another sidearm. It has some okay damage perks. Alongside that, in the first column, you have things like Wellspring, maybe Disruption Break if you want to build into that. You compare that with Vorpal, but I think most of the time most people are going to be building into Incandescent and Wellspring. This is the competition for Calus Mini-Tool. In my opinion, the Mini-Tool is a little bit better, but if you are going to be trying to get your abilities back with Wellspring and Incandescent, this is a pretty solid combination. And with this origin trait also granting you bonus discipline and strength if you get kills while you have your super, this is a pretty solid roll. I think this is going to go into A tier. I think the other incandescent options that we do have are better, but if this is all you have, this is very solid, and you can also play to get your abilities back. And I guess if you want to go down the route of Disruption Break and Vorpal for maybe something like a GM weapon, that could also be pretty solid. The next up is the Imperial Decree. We have another sidearm. This is going to be a kinetic sidearm, so again, you can't use a kinetic special weapon, and its perk pool is really also not the greatest. In its first column, it really has no good reload speed based perk other than Compulsive Reloader, and even with that, this perk is really not that good on primary weapons. And for damage perks, you really only have Swashbuckler, but I guess you can also play into something like Unrelenting if you want your health back. And its origin trait, again, is pretty solid. You can make them do 10% less damage, so it's kind of like a mini Sever in a way, but with this perk pool just being kind of bad, you don't really have any good combinations whatsoever, and other options are 100% better than this thing. I think it's going to go in the not good territory. I don't think it's a never use because you do have things like Swash and Compulsive Reloader. If it's the only thing you do have, and since the origin trait is nice, there's definitely some ways you can craft it, but it is definitely not good. And if you do compare it to something like in the C category, I would almost always choose to use these just because they have better perk pools or some fun combinations with something like Blood Feud, but this doesn't really have that much, so I think that's why it's going in the D tier spot. Now that we got our first D tier out of the way, let's move into the next one. That is Fang Of Ir Yut. This is going to be a rapid fire frame strand scout rifle, and it has some okay options. In the first column, you have shoot to loot, rewind rounds, rapid hit, and alongside that, precision instrument, tricorn, sword logic, hatchling, and I guess even kill clip. Again, its origin trait is also good. If you get a melee kill, you can cause explosions with the weapon, but since this is a scout rifle, you probably aren't going to be getting that many melee kills if you're sitting back with it. And for its perk combinations, you do have a classic reload speed based perk alongside a damage perk, even rewind rounds and precision instrument if you're trying to go for like a champion based thing. You also have hatchling if you want to play into a threadling based build. So pretty solid overall. I don't think it's as good as some other options, especially things like Doom and Chelchis, but if you do want to play in a threatenly build, and if this is the only scout rifle you do have, I definitely think it deserves the B tier spot. Once again, it is going in that kinetic slot, so it is limiting you from a kinetic special, but it is still overall pretty solid with its perk combinations, and I think you could definitely get some mileage out of it if you do build into it correctly. The next up is the Fel Taradiddle. Now this is going to be a kinetic lightweight frame bow, so you're probably going to be using this for single target damage, and for that, this does have Archer's Tempo and Explosive Payload, and it also has Psycho Hack, so again, doing damage will make them do 10% less damage, which is nice. But on top of that, you also have Shoot to Loot as well. You could even pair that with something like Successful Warm-Up, Archer's Tempo just to fire it really fast, one for all for a damage perk. So overall, some pretty solid perk combinations, and that's why I think this is going in the A tier slot. I don't think it's S tier, but with this decent origin trait, Archer's Tempo is pretty much just a must on every bow in PvE in my opinion, and it does have it. Explosive Hit's also very solid. You can definitely take out some tankier targets with this bow. Now next up is the Firefright, and this is going to be a precision frame kinetic weapon. Its perk pool really is not the greatest. It does have things like 4 times the charm and maybe Focus Fury if you're trying to use this for a champion based weapon. And it also has things like Threat Detector and Surround It if you're trying to use it for, I guess, close range ad clear. And with its origin trait, you could also get Final Blows nearby combatants to restore health, so that will play into Surround It and Threat Detector, so a pretty unique interaction. But those two are pretty much the only main things that this weapon does have, and for that reason, that's why I think it's going to go in the D tier. It does have some pretty fun setups if you, again, do play into, you know, things like Threat Detector, Surround It, but I don't ever think that's going to be good, and if you're running close range like that, you might as well use an SMG or a sidearm. And again, with 4 times the charm and Focus Fury, there are going to be better weapons that can just play into that champion single target damage primary fantasy, and it also goes in your kinetic slot, so you can't use kinetic specials. So that's why I think it's just not good. There are going to be better options, and you should probably never use this thing unless you are just trying to have fun and mess around with it. The next up is the Forensic Nightmare. This is going to be a precision frame stasis SMG. This thing doesn't really have that crazy perks either. You can have Headstone since it is a stasis weapon. You can build into that with the Psycho Hack origin trait. It's also pretty solid. But in the first column, when it comes to reload speed based perk, you really only have Perpetual Motion. I guess you could take Slotways. And once again, like I've said before, there are going to be better Headstone options, and this will also take your kinetic slot. So that's why I think it's going to go in the C tier. Without having a pretty solid reload speed based perk, it really doesn't have that much going for it, and the best damage perk it has is Kill Clip, so you're probably going to be building a Headstone if you are using this anyway, but there are going to be better options. But if this is the only thing you do have, it's definitely usable, and that's why I think it can go in the C tier slot. The next up is the Calus hand cannon. This is going to be a void 180 round per minute hand cannon. There's going to be a lot of these, honestly, when it comes to crafted variants. So taking a look at this thing, its perk pool is just kind of, it does have assistance, rapid hit stats for all, and you can pair that with, you know, Repulse Brace, Frenzy, Rampage, Tricle 1 for all, so some okay damage perks. And its origin trait's also pretty solid, so whenever you break a shield, you will actually reload the magazine some. So with some pretty decent damage perks and some okay reload speed based perks, I think this is definitely going to go in the B tier spot. We're going to get into some later that are definitely going to be lower and some higher as well, so I think this is a pretty solid middle ground. This is a good option with its origin trait, and again, just some solid damage perks. But you're probably not going to use this if you do have some of the other options, and this will for sure be better than some of the other things that we get into later. The next up is the Calus SMG. Now this one might shock some of you because I'm not going to rank it S tier, and this does have the same origin trait, so when you break shield you can reload some of the gun, which is nice. It has some decent damage perks, things like Frenzy, Surround It. Volt Shot is probably going to be your main go-to. You can pair that with things like Threat Detector, Feed and Frenzy, and also has Shoot to Loot as well, so some pretty decent damage perks. And this was one of the best weapons in the game for a while, and the only reason it's not going in S tier is simply because there is a better weapon than it now. This is going in the A tier spot. It is still very good. If this is the only weapon you do have, I would still recommend running this. It is probably going to be your best Volt Shot option, except if you have the Subjunctive. Now we're just going to skip around and transition right to this one so I can explain why this is in the A tier spot. And that is because of this weapon. As you see here, this also has Volt Shot, and this is going to be a lightweight frame SMG. So whereas this one is not a lightweight frame, with this one you will get that bonus movement speed. It does do slightly better DPS than the Calus SMG, and you even still have perks like Threat Detector, which the Calus SMG has. Now alongside that, this weapon also has Shoot to Loot, so same perks in the same first column, but it also has additions to things like Stats for All. Depending on your playstyle, Threat Detector and Stats for All are both very solid options to reload the gun faster, to proc Volt Shot more often, and then in my opinion, This also has a better origin trait, so you're standing by teammates, you're going to be building stacks of this up, and you can just shoot this weapon forever. Every time you reach the bottom of the magazine, it will auto reload some bullets in it, so even the origin trait is kind of acting the same way as the other one. It's just slightly better. Everything about the subjunctive is pretty much the Calus SMG, just slightly better. It has the same perks in the first column. You could argue stats for all maybe is slightly better than something like Feud and Frenzy. It has Volt Shot. The origin trait is slightly better. The archetype is slightly better, and overall it's just a little bit above the Calus SMG, and that's why that one deserves the S tier spot, where the Calus deserves the A tier spot. But again, Calus, if this is the only one you do have, it is still very, very solid. But if you do have subjunctive, it is just going to be slightly better. But now let's move on to a less exciting one, and that is the Imperative. This is a high impact frame kinetic scout rifle. Honestly, isn't that bad. It does have some pretty cool perk combinations with things like triple tap, and with its origin trait, you can pretty much just never have to reload the gun. You compare that with things like kinetic tremors, and it is a pretty solid GM weapon. You're going to do some pretty decent single target damage. Even if you want to pair this with things like Demo, Kinetic Tremors gets a kill, you can get Demolitionist procs to get more grenade energy back. Alongside that, it does have explosive payload, maybe attrition orbs if you want to build into that, but Kinetic Tremors is probably going to be your way to go. Even Rapacious if you want to take that as well. Very, very solid perk combinations. That's why I think it deserves the B tier spot. I don't think this is going to be the best scout rifle in the game by any means, but if you are building into what it can be pretty decent at, I think it is a pretty solid option. Then next up we have Insidious. Now this is going to be an aggressive burst arc pulse rifle. This has some very solid perks. You have Dragonfly, Stats for All, Demo, Rapid Hit, alongside Rampage, Adrenaline Junkie, maybe Vorpal, One for All, and I guess also maybe Bait and Switch. And if that wasn't enough, you also have Soul Dranker, which is one of the best origin traits in the game. You do damage, you reload, you get some health back. It's basically Hill Clip just in an origin trait, which is very, very nice. And this has a couple of different ways you can build it. It has a very, very solid active build with Dragonfly One for All. Dragonfly can actually proc One for All. You have one of the highest damage perks in the game, alongside Calls and Explosions. If you want ability energy back, you can go with Demo. And if One for All is not your thing for ad clear, you even have Rampage and Adrenaline Junkie. Adrenaline Junkie with Demo is obviously a very solid option, and there are just a ton of different ways you can go about this. This, in my opinion, if there was a pulse rifle that had to be an S tier, I think this is going to be the one. Obviously, pulse rifles are not that crazy in the meta, but if they ever were to become meta in the final shape, I think this is the pulse rifle you're going to want to craft. It is probably the best ad clear pulse rifle in the game, and it even has a couple different ways you can build it. With its origin trait being very solid, this is for sure the go-to. Now, I do want to say, kind of like the subjunctive, it has a very, very close competition, and it took me a while to debate which one I wanted to put in S tier, and that is actually going to be the Oversoul Edict. We're going to skip around again. This is going to be a rapid fire frame arc pulse rifle. It does have the curse stall origin trait, so you can cause explosions after you get a melee kill, which is nice. But in the first perk column, you have Enlighten Action and Demo, which are pretty much your only two go-tos, but you also have Swash, you have Adrenaline Junkie, you have Sword Logic, you have Volt Shot. All those are pretty solid. What's really cool, Volt Shot can proc Curse Through All, so you can cause explosions everywhere with Volt Shot, which is very, very fun. But with things like Demo and Volt Shot, very, very solid perk combinations to get your grenade back. You can add clear like crazy. Even Enlighten Action and Sword Logic, if you just want to go a damage route, that's also very solid. But overall, I do think Insidious just has slightly better perk combinations and more perks to choose from, whereas this one doesn't. And that's why I ended up putting Oversoul in the A tier slot. But it is very close to Insidious, and depending on whatever pulse rifle you want to craft, they're both going to be very solid. They're even both arc as well. And also, I think to note, I think the Soul Drinker origin trait is slightly better than the Curse Stall origin trait. So again, we're running into another just slightly better between Subjunctive and Calus, where I think Insidious is just slightly better than Oversoul Edict. Now, next up is the Kept Confidence. This is going to be a straight adaptive frame hand cannon, and in the first column, really its only good perk is Stats for All. I guess you can make loose change work with this season with unraveling rounds, but when that goes away, you're not going to be able to take advantage of it as much. And then in the second column, you really only have multi-kill clip for a damage perk, maybe collective action and pugilist, and its origin trait is also bad. There are way better hand cannons than this, in my opinion. Even if you look at something like Austringer, it goes in the same slot. It does more damage. It has better perk combinations for reload and damage. So I think this is just going to go in the D tier. I don't like this hand cannon at all. Maybe you want to rate this a little higher. You can definitely let me know in the comments below, but this hand cannon to me is just not the greatest. I have never ever really used this for PvE at all. It is fun in PvP, but when it comes to PvE, it's definitely not good, but it does have some okay combinations if it's the only thing you do have. And that's why I don't think it should go in the never use category, because again, if it's the only thing you do have, you could definitely make it work. But even then, I would still recommend using something like Austringer, even though that's in the C tier. The next up, we have the Lethophobia. This is a void lightweight frame bow. Now, this doesn't have archer tempo in the first column, but it does have things like successful warm up if you're trying to use it for ad clear. You can pair that with things like explosive head, but the main thing is that this weapon has disruption break, so you can take a shield off with this thing, and then your kinetic weapon would do more damage. You can maybe pair that with permanent ability as well, so when you use your class ability, you will actually change the element of this weapon, so you can take a shield down easier. So that's a pretty cool combination. It has some okay damage perks, but I don't really think you're ever going to be using this thing over some other bows, simply for the fact that it doesn't have archer tempo. But if you do want to build into that disruption break fantasy, I think you definitely can do it, and that's why I'm going to put it in this C tier spot. It's not the craziest thing in the game. There are way better bows you can use for PvE, but since it does have a pretty unique interaction, I think that's why it can go in the okay spot, but I'm probably never going to use it over other stuff. The next up is the Mykel's Reverence. This is a rapid fire frame strand sidearm, and in the first column, you have things like Unrelenting, Rerun Rounds, and Pugilist. Alongside in the second column, you have Frenzy, Swashbuckler, and Hatchling. Its origin trait will also give you more damage to Loose and Hive and Tormentor, so that's a pretty solid origin trait. Unfortunately, since this is strand, it will take your kinetic slot, but its perk combinations of Pugilist and Swash are very fun. You can also have Unrelenting and Hatchling as well, so just a pretty solid at clear sidearm. You can play it to Unraveling Rounds as well, and I think that's why this is going to go in the A tier slot. When it comes to sidearms, this definitely can compete with something like Drang, and if you're playing into Hatchling, you can obviously have a threatening base build. And a perk I forgot to mention is Paracall's Infinity, which is another damage perk to make this very nice. So again, just very solid ad clear overall. And if you ever need to use a strand sidearm, this is for sure going to be a go-to one. Next up is the Nation of Beasts. This is going to be an arc adaptive frame hand cannon. I actually really like this weapon. It has things like Dragonfly in the first column, which honestly is pretty much the only perk you should get. But in the second column, you do have Collective Action, Golden Tricorn, Explosive Payload, Kill Clip, and Volt Shot. So a lot of decent perks for the second column, whereas the first column really only has one. But you can base the weapon off that and build into ad clear for this weapon. So with things like Dragonfly and Volt Shot, you could just blow an entire room up, which is nice. You could also go Dragonfly Explosive Payload to kind of have a mini Fatebringer in your energy slot, which is also very, very nice. And even if you just want to go a traditional damage route, you also have perks for that as well. And with this origin trait also giving you bonuses when you throw a grenade, this can also be pretty solid because you're typically going to be playing into a grenade based build if you are playing into something like Volt Shot, because Jolt is just disgusting on arc grenades. I think this is a overall very solid option. I think that's why I'm going to put it in the A tier spot. If you want to go into the crazy blow up a room ad clear, you can. If you want to go into just a very solid, consistent Fatebringer type role, you can. Or if you just even want to go traditional damage route, you can. So it has some very solid perk combinations for anything you want to go down. I don't think it's S tier by any means, but it is very good, and I have used this a lot myself. But even with that, if I'm running a Volt Shot weapon, I'm taking Subjunctive pretty much every day of the week. Now, next up, we have the Optative, and this is another Void 180. I said we're going to have a good amount of these. Here's another one, and unfortunately, this is the one that's going to be kind of worse than the Aikilos hand cannon. It does have the nano munitions origin trait, which is pretty solid. But in the first perk column, you have things like Repulsive Race, Demo, Rapid Hit, maybe Attrition Orbs. You can pair that out with Golden Tricorn, Kill Clip, and that's pretty much your only other options. You can go with Wellspring and Demo, which I think is the fun role. And if you are going to craft this is what I would go for. Just so you can get a ton of grenade energy back whenever you get a kill. But if you're going for a damage route, the Aikilos hand cannon is going to be better. It just has better damage perks overall, and it even has some better reload speed or mag based perks too, in my opinion. So this is pretty much your go-to option if you do want to use this weapon. And that's why I think it deserves the C tier spot. It is fun. I don't think you're going to be using this over pretty much anything else in the game, but if you want to get your grenades back super fast, this is definitely something that you can use. And that's why I'm putting it in the C tier spot. All right, coming up next is the Perpetualis. This is going to be a strand adaptive frame auto rifle. This thing's perk combinations are really not the greatest. In the first column, you basically have nothing that's usable. I guess Keep Away being your best reload speed based perk, Envious Assassin for some other combinations. But in the second column, you do have Demo, Cascade Point, Tricorn, and Hatchling. So if you don't have a Hatchling weapon, I guess this could be solid. But with Envious Assassin, you can pair that with Cascade Point just to unload a bunch of rounds. You're never really going to be using this a lot in PvE. It is fun on paper, but In practice, obviously it's not going to be that good, and with no reload speed or mag based perk, it's going to feel kind of bad to use something like a damage perk. And with demo, there are other auto rifles that just have it in the left column, so having it in the right column to take away from a damage perk or something like Hatchling, this thing is just really not that good, and that's why I'm going to put it in the D tier spot. There are way better auto rifles even in this tier list once we get later down the line, and I would pretty much never recommend using this. And even if you want a hatchling weapon, just run something like a different times, because it will be slightly better in my opinion, just because it does have better perk combinations. The next up is the Phyllotactic Spiral. This is an arc high impact frame pulse rifle. In the first column, really your only perk is compulsive reloader, and it's not the greatest on primaries, but with this weapon it kind of can be good because you do have things like volt shot. So this is pretty much your only go-to option for this weapon. I guess you do have kill clip, maybe frenzy, but if you're built into this compulsive reloader volt shot, you get a kill, you can reload super fast, proc volt shot, and with its origin trait also providing you extra damage because you can basically just shoot rockets out of this thing, it is pretty solid. It is not going to be the best volt shot option by any means, but if this is your only option, you can make it work, and that's why I'm going to put it in the C tier spot. Its origin trait being pretty solid is what's bumping that up a good amount, but just being able to reload super quick, proc a volt shot, and it's also a long range weapon, so you can kind of do it from further away. It is a nice thing to have, but I'm never using it over pretty much anything else. Now, next up is the Peace of Mind. Now, this is primarily a PvP pulse rifle, but it does have things like overflow and auto-loading stats for all. And then in the second column, you really only have Vorpal and Focus Fury, so this is going to be playing heavily into a single target damage option, with its origin trait also granting you bonus resistance on kills. I guess this can be okay for PvE, but if you are going to be running a single target damage pulse rifle, I would pretty much just use Chattering Bone or even some of the other weapons we're going to get into later. So I don't really foresee this thing being that good in my opinion, and that's why I'm going to put it in the D tier spot. I could argue move it up to C, because something like auto-loading Vorpal, if you're running something like double primary, something like a GM, you know, if there's like a pulse rifle champion mod in its current season, maybe I could see C tier, but I think overall, if there's no champion mods, you're never going to be using this thing. That's why I'm going to put it in the D tier. The next up is the Pointed Inquiry. This is a high impact frame void scout rifle. Kind of like the Come to Pass, it has a pretty unique interaction with things like Genesis and Adaptive Munitions. Again, Match Game's not really in the game anymore, so it's not super crazy, but you also have Genesis and Turnabout, so you can also get an overshield and reload the gun, which is nice. But you also have things like Shoot to Loot on here, Stats for All, Dragonfly, Stats for All demo, so some pretty solid options overall. This is not going to be the greatest weapon in the game by any means, but since it does have its unique interactions, I am going to throw it in C tier. I think if you are going to be playing into that shield break interaction, Come to Pass is going to be better, and also Come to Pass has a lot better damage options in its right column, whereas this weapon really only has Dragonfly. So overall, I think, again, if you are playing into that, Come to Pass will be better, and they even have the same origin trait. So if you're going to be doing that, just use Come to Pass, but if you don't have it, this one will be okay. Next up is Posterity. This is a arc precision frame hand cannon, so it is a 180, so I know a lot of people are going to write it off already, but it does have some pretty solid options. In the left column, you do have things like Volt Shot, and I guess maybe Reconstruction and Rapid Hit, but most of the time you're going to be taking Volt Shot. But in the right column, you have Rampage, you have Frenzy, and even Pugilist if you want to get your ability energy back, and pair that with the origin trait that will also get you ability energy back. That could be a very, very nice combination if you are playing into a melee build. The main thing for this is the fact that it does have Volt Shot and a damage perk, so you can act clear like crazy, and you could do a lot of damage to get that Volt Shot proc. You're probably going to go Volt Shot and Frenzy, so you can get your reload speed up with Frenzy as well, so you can obviously reload Volt Shot even faster. And I think with those perk combinations, the fact that it can act clear and just do some decent single target damage, we're going to put it in the A tier spot. I think if you do compare this to Nations of Beasts, they definitely can't compete with each other. I don't think either of them deserve the S tier spot, and we are saving a hand cannon for that S tier spot, but they are very solid. But again, if you're using a Volt Shot option, you might as well go with Subjunctive because it is just the better thing to use. Next up is the Raconteur. Now, this is going to be a stasis precision frame bow. This does have arch tempo, so we're already starting off pretty strong, but it also has Shoot to Loot if you don't play into that. Alongside that, Explosive Head, Headstone, Rampage, even Pugilist. The origin trait's kind of but it has some pretty solid perks. If you want to go into a single target damage thing with Arch Tempo, Explosive Head, there's like a Stasis Surge. It has that. If you want to go into Headstone for Act Clear, it has Arch Tempo Headstone, so you can blow the crystal up, just act clear like crazy. And even if you just want to go into a Arch Tempo successful warm-up thing, so you could just shoot the bow really fast, or even Rampage to do more damage, this thing is very solid. It has overall very, very good perks. It does take your kinetic slot, unfortunately, but since it does have headstone, it kind of makes up for it, so you can play into that subclass verb. So I think that's why it's going to go in the A tier spot. Personally, I think there is going to be a better bow that goes in the S tier spot later down the line, but this weapon is very solid if it is the only bow that you do have, and that's why I think it deserves to go into the very good category. Now, next up is the Rapacious Appetite. This is a stasis aggressive frame SMG, so it's going to be competing with Blood Feud, but in my opinion, this thing has just worse perks. In the first column, you basically have nothing really. You have, I guess, maybe 4 times charm and envious, perpetual motion, but obviously, I mean, those things are really not that good. One for all for damage, headstone for ad clear, and also frenzy for damage as well. And it also even has the envious cascade or envious target lock roll. Its origin trait is pretty much pointless, and if I were to use a stasis aggressive frame SMG, I'm probably going to be using Blood Feud because it just has the better magazine base perk, even if you combine both of these weapons. Ambitious Assassin is not the greatest, but it's better than pretty much anything this weapon does have, so that's why I'm just going to throw it in the D tier spot. Better origin trait, slightly better perks, and they virtually are trying to do the exact same thing in my opinion. The next up is the Round Robin. This is going to have the nanotech rockets origin trait, so we can just do some more damage, which is nice. In the first perk column though, we're kind of running into the same thing. Envious on primary weapons, I guess, isn't the worst, but you're not going to be taking advantage of it too much. So the best perk you probably have is Subsistence. You can pair that with things like Pugilist to get your melee energy up. You also have Golden Tricorn as well if you want some damage. Kill Clip really isn't the greatest on here because if you're running Subsistence, you're not going to have to reload the gun, and Hatchling is okay if you're playing into a threatening based build. I would probably just go with Subsistence and Hatchling. If this is your only threatening option, this is pretty solid, and that's why I'm going to throw it in the C tier spot. But speaking of threatening options, next up is Rufus's Fury. This is a very solid auto rifle. It has the origin trait to do more damage to Lucent Hive and Tormentors, but alongside that, you have Reconstruction, you have Rewind Rounds, you have Pugilist and Demo in the first column to get whatever ability energy you want back. Alongside that, you have Target Lock to pair with Reconstruction, you have Adrenaline Junkie, Frenzy, Paracalls Affinity, and Hatchling. Very, very solid perk combinations. I honestly would rank this S tier, but for the fact that it takes your kinetic slot, I think I'm going to put it in A tier. But with Demo and Hatchling, you have a crazy threatening build that you can run with this thing. You also have some very solid damage perks that there is a Strain Surge on. And overall, this is probably going to be one of the best auto rifles in the game, except if you are comparing it to Abyss Defiant. I think Abyss Defiant is slightly better. The next up is the Scalar Potential. This is a ARC rapid fire frame pulse rifle. This is going to be competing with Oversoul Edict, so obviously it's a pretty good competition. In the first column, it does have Overflow and Enlighten Action, and the second column, really the only perk it has is Golden Tricorn, and the origin trait for this, I guess, is okay for this weapon, but overall there really isn't a lot going for this thing. It does have a reload speed based perk alongside a damage based perk, so that's why I'm just going to throw it in C tier. If this is the only pulse rifle you have, and if pulse rifles ever become meta, you can definitely build this. Just get a bunch of reload speed, get a bunch of damage. I could almost argue put it in D tier, but I think for the fact that it just does have the classic, kind of like Austringer, I think it can go in the C tier spot. It's okay, but I probably wouldn't use it over the other options. The next up is the Smite of Merain. Now, this has some pretty decent perks. You have things like Pugilist and Stats for All and Demo alongside Firefly, One for All, Swash, Adrenaline Junkie. It even has some very fun perk combinations of things like Focus Fury and Vorpal, kind of like Doom and Chelchis does, but you can also pair Focus Fury and One for All together to just get some insane damage increases on things like GMs. This is a very, very solid combination, especially since it's kinetic, so it's doing 10% more damage as well. You also have its origin trait too that can overflow the magazine if you reload near teammates. So depending on if you want to go a single target damage route, or if you want to go a more traditional just ad clear route with things like Firefly, maybe Demo to get some grenade energy back, or Stats for All for reload speed, pairing that with Firefly, you can just reload very, very fast. This thing has a lot going on for it, and so that is why I'm going to throw it in the A tier spot. Very solid ad clear, very solid single target damage. There's some fun builds you can do with it, and overall it's just a very good pulse rifle. I don't think it's as good as Insidious, but if you do want to build into that crazy single target damage route on things like champions, you could definitely make this thing work. And next up is the Submission. Now, this was a pretty popular SMG. This is a kinetic 900 RPM. It is very, very solid. It does have Soul Drinker, again, one of the best origin traits in the game. Unfortunately, with this weapon though, it doesn't have like a pretty good load speed based perk. It does have Subsistence and Overflow, which are very strong, but you can't really proc Soul Drinker with either of those, with Subsistence I guess being the best option to be able to proc Soul Drinker. But it does have Frenzy to increase that reload speed up, which is nice. That kind of takes up for the reload speed based perk, so that Frenzy is probably going to be the best way to go. But you also have things like Demo if you want to get your ability energy back, and if you like Swash, you have that too. So overall, pretty solid SMG. I don't think it's as good as other SMGs that we do have in the S tier category, but if you need a decent kinetic SMG, this definitely can go in the A tier spot. And with things like the Adjudicator being out now, I would probably just recommend getting that, because that probably is going to be the S tier SMG in my opinion. But again, since this is the crafted tier list, we don't have the Adjudicator, so that's why I'm just going to throw this in the A tier spot, because it is pretty solid. Now next up, we have the Sweet Sorrow. Now I'm probably going to shock a lot of you all with this one, but I think this is one of the best auto rifles in the game. If we take a look at its perk pool, it doesn't have anything too crazy going on for it, but it does have things like stats for all in the first column and 1 for all in the second column. And I think this perk combination is enough on its own to make it very solid. And you can also pair that with its origin trait, which I think is what is really bumping this weapon up. And that is the fact that you get 5% damage reduction on every single kill. This can stack up to 3 times, so 15% damage reduction just for killing enemies. Since you have to hit 3 targets anyway, it's going to be really easy to proc the max stacks of this. So you're going to get one of the highest damage perks in the game. You're going to get a ton of stats for your weapon, including reload speed to reload it faster, and you're getting damage reduction. So overall, to me, this is just a very workhorse auto rifle, and that's why I'm actually going to throw this in the S tier. If you don't know what weapon you want to run, you can just throw this thing on. It is going to do pretty much any content in the game that you need to do. Normal content, in-game content. With its origin trait, you're also getting that damage reduction, and it is very solid. Now next up, we have the Syncopation. Now this is a Stasive adaptive frame pulse rifle. Primarily use this in PvP, but it does have things like Outlaw on it. You can also have Frenzy, Headstone. It's not the worst, and if you do want to build into like a reload speed Headstone based thing, you know, this is pretty solid. It does have the origin trait that can also grant you bonus handling and flinch resistance. Obviously not the greatest thing in PvE, but you can build into it with Outlaw, so that's pretty cool. So I think overall, I think this is probably just going to be a C tier option. If you don't have a decent, you know, headstone weapon, this can definitely get the job done. But there are much better options out there, and with it being just super easy to craft, if you want a fun roll, you can definitely go out and get this thing. And next up, we have the Targeted Redaction. This is going to be an aggressive void hand cannon, so it can play into volatile rounds. Its origin trait, again, Unsated Hunger, really not that good, but it does have things like Outlaw in the first column, with that being its best perk. You compare that with Destabilizing Rounds, Explosive Payload, Frenzy. All of these are going to be pretty solid. I don't think this hand cannon is really that good by any means, but with its decent perk combinations, I definitely think you could throw this in the C tier. If you just want a very fast reloaded hand cannon with, you know, a decent damage perk, or if you want to play into Destabilizing Rounds, this could be pretty fun for you. There are better hand cannons out there, but if this is all you got, it definitely can work. Now next up is going to be the Tarnished Mettle. This is going to be an arc lightweight frame scout rifle. So lightweight frame, you are getting that bonus movement speed, which is nice. But if we take a look at its perks, this thing has some very solid perk combinations. You have things like Shoot to Loot and Explosive Payload, again, that classic combination. You also have things like Rapid Hit and Dragonfly if you just want reload damage. But you also have Demo and Volt Shot. So again, kind of like the Oversoul Edict, but this is just on a scout rifle now, so you can get a bunch of grenade energy back. You can also, you know, clear everything with Volt Shot. Even if you want to go Rapid Hit Volt Shot or a classic damage perk with Swashbuckler and Multi-Kill Clip, there are just a ton of very solid combinations on this scout rifle. Now, the right hook origin trait, unfortunately, isn't going to be getting that much benefit since you are using a scout rifle and you've got to melee people for this thing. But even with that, the other perk combinations on this weapon are very strong, and that's why I'm going to put this scout rifle in the A tier. With Demo and Volt Shot, it is just disgustingly good. And again, even if you want to go Shoot to Loot, so it's a payload, that's also very good for something like a GM. So you have utility and you even have ad clear, depending on however you want to build it. Now next up is another scout rifle, and that is Tears of Contrition. This is a kinetic precision frame scout rifle. Unfortunately, this thing doesn't have too much going for it, and other scout rifles are just better. But it does have things like Triple Tap, probably being its best perk in the first column, with Explosive Payload being the second best perk. Extrovert doesn't really proc too much since you are using a scout rifle. You're not going to be too close to enemies anyway. And if you have something like Night Watch, I would pretty much just always use that as a kinetic scout rifle option. But if this is all you have, I think C tier is pretty decent. You have Explosive Payload, you have Triple Tap, you can just sit back, you just plink away at an enemy. And, you know, it does have a use case for that sense, but I think other options will just be better if you are using a scout rifle for that. Now next up is the Transfiguration. This is a high impact frame kinetic, so just like the Imperative, you're competing with that. This does have pretty much the same perk combinations. You're probably going to be building kinetic trimmers with this, but it also has things like Demo as well. You also have Rapid Hit. You also have access to double damage with things like Rampage and Kill Clip, even Rewind rounds as well if you do want to pair that with kinetic trimmers. So overall, pretty solid. I think this can compete with Imperative. I don't think it's going to be the craziest thing in the game, so that's why I'm just going to throw it in the B tier spot. And now next up is the Tripwire Canary. Honestly, a very slept on bow. It's very solid. It's a lightweight arc bow. It does have Archer's Tempo. It also has Dragonfly in the first column if you're into that, but alongside that, it has Explosive Payload, Frenzy, even Successful Warm-Up if you want to go Successful Warm-Up Dragonfly. So again, you're probably going to be building Archer's Tempo, Explosive Head. It's pretty much just the go-to perk roll for both ad clear and single target damage. But what's really cool about this bow is the fact that Vice Stinger can actually proc on this and pair with Archer's Tempo. So you could just have crazy fast draw time with this, alongside also doing decent single target damage. And that's why I think it's going to go in the A tier spot. It's very solid. I don't think it's a must craft, but it is one of the better bows in the game in my opinion. And now next up we have the Trusty. So starting off, we already have a decent origin trait to give us ability energy back. When we take a look at its perks, we have Reconstruction, Pugilist, Rapid Hit. All of those are pretty solid. And then in the right column we have Wellspring and Incandescent, maybe even Swashbuckler, but Incandescent is probably going to be your go-to. You can build into Pugilist, Wellspring, and the origin trait just if you're trying to get crazy amounts of melee energy back, but most people are probably just going to go Rapid Hit and Incandescent or Reconstruction Incandescent. So a very solid Incandescent option, because this will also give you ability energy back. And what's really cool, the Scorch on Incandescent can actually proc this origin trait, so you can get a ton of ability energy back. And for that reason, I'm going to throw it in the A tier. It's definitely not the best Incandescent option with some of the other stuff we have up here, but it is very solid. And if you need a longer range variant, this is definitely going to have you covered. And now next up, we have the Tyranny of Heaven. Now this is a very solid bow. It does have Arch Tempo, so starting off with a good start. But I think the main thing for this bow is the fact that it has Dragonfly and Incandescent. This basically turns this into a mini Sunshot, but in bow form. You can just cause a ton of explosions, and with this season particularly, it is very strong, but even without that, it's still very good. And even if you don't like this combination, it has Archer's Tempo 1 for all, it has Explosive Head 1 for all, it even has Tricorn, Collective Action if you prefer those damage perks. Its origin trait, it's not the greatest for this thing, but with its crazy good perk combinations and with its uniqueness of basically just turning this into a Sunshot but a legendary weapon, I think Tyranny of Heaven definitely deserves to go in the S tier. It is very strong for ad clear if you do need to use a bow, and it also has its classic combinations of damage if you do need to use that as well. Now the next one is another bow, and that is Under Your Skin. Now I've been saving this bow because I still think this is one of the best bows in the game in my opinion. It is void, so it can play into volatile. It is precision frame. It has Archer's Tempo in the first column, so you're good to go. You're set for that. But if you don't like that, it also has Unrelenting, but Archer's Tempo for sure going to be the way to go. You have Explosive Head, Dragonfly as well, Successful Warm-Up. All those are very solid options. Explosive Head probably going to be your best go-to. But just like the Sweet Sorrow, I cannot stress this enough. Land Take origin trait is so strong. You get 15% damage reduction on top of your other things that are granting you damage reduction, and it also gives resilience if you don't have max resilience. So you have some of the best bow perk combinations in the game, alongside, in my opinion, one of the best origin traits in the game, and it can play into volatile. So that's why I'm going to throw this into S tier as well. It is very solid. It definitely can compete with Tyranny of Heaven, if not better than Tyranny of Heaven. Honestly, you maybe could argue moving Tyranny of Heaven to A tier, but I still think it deserves the S tier spot because of the ad clear combination that it does have. But overall, these are just some of the best bows in the game for legendary craftable options. We're finally getting to the end of this video. I've been recording for 1 hour and 50 minutes where we have the Word of Crota. This is another Void 180 hand cannon. So this is the third one now in this crafted tier list, but this is going to be the best one. It has crazy good perks: Subsistence, Dragonfly, Repulsor Brace, Enlightened Action, Demo, alongside Precision Instrument, Frenzy, Sword Lodge, Rampage, Stabilizing Rounds, Adrenaline Junkie. Its origin traits also very solid to cause explosions. Every perk on this weapon is very strong. Pretty much any one of them you go with is going to be good. Dragonfly damage, you know, for ad clear, single target damage. Repulsor Brace, Stabilize Rounds if you want to play into that. Demo alongside anything else just for ad clear. Very solid. Not going to put it in the S tier because I think there is one more hand cannon that deserves to go in the S tier spot. I don't know if you can tell which one, so that's why I'm going to throw it in A tier. And the fact that it's also a 180, it kind of drags down a little bit, but it is the best option out of all the other Void 180s. And again, its perk pool is just absurd, and if you like 180s, this is one you're definitely going to want to get. And now finally, our last weapon is the Zalu's Bane, and if you couldn't tell, this is going to go in the S tier spot. If we take a look at its perks, it has some very solid perks. You have Pugilist for ability of generation, you have Explosive Payload. This is probably going to be your go-to option, but alongside that, you have Demo, you also have Firefly, you have Incandescent, and One for All. One for All being very solid for just doing extra damage, Incandescent being very solid for ad clear if you build into solo builds. Firefly pair it with explosive payload, you have a mini Fatebringer that doesn't go into your kinetic slot, and you even have fun combinations of Pugilist and Demo if you just want to get your ability energy back. Alongside that, the Origin trait's also very good. So overall, crazy good combinations, fun combinations, good Origin trait. I think this is definitely going to go in the S tier spot. It is the best hand cannon you can craft, in my opinion. And what's really cool about this tier list is that we actually didn't put anything in F. Pretty much everything, I guess, kind of has a use case, where some just being obviously way better than others. But overall, most of the primaries are useful if you do even use a primary in the game. I know a lot of people just run double special, but if you are a primary enjoyer, you can definitely get a lot of mileage out of a lot of these. There's just a couple I probably would just choose some others over. But all right, that is going to do it for the primary tier list. I think this might have been the longest video I've ever recorded. We are currently sitting at 2 hours. Obviously, I'm going to edit this down, so it's probably going to be about an hour long. So if you sit through this whole thing, I truly appreciate it. And definitely be sure to comment the word primary. I'll try to heart every single one of them, because you are a trooper if you sat through this whole thing. Anyway, so that's going to do it all for me. I definitely need to rest my voice right now. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you all have a great day. Peace.